I never thought a petty neighborhood dispute could destroy my life. But that was before Margaret Wilson moved in next door and decided I was her enemy. For 30 years, I'd lived peacefully in my little colonial on Maple Street, a quiet suburban cul-de-sac where most residents had grown old together. I'd raised my 2 daughters here after my husband passed away from a heart attack when they were teenagers. I'd hosted countless block parties in my backyard and brought casseroles to every new family. At 67, I was ready to enjoy my golden years in the community that had become my extended family. Then Margaret moved in. She purchased the Henderson house after old Bill passed away and his children decided to sell. The day she arrived, I did what I'd always done, baked my special cinnamon apple bread and walked over with a warm smile and warmer loaf. "Welcome to the neighborhood," I said when she opened the door. "I'm Eleanor Jenkins from next door. I brought you a little housewarming gift." Margaret Wilson was an elegant woman around my age, with expertly colored auburn hair and the kind of subtle cosmetic work that spoke of money and careful maintenance. Her eyes, a sharp blue, assessed me without warmth. "How quaint," she said, taking the bread with 2 fingers as if it might contaminate her. "I don't eat carbs, but I'm sure the movers might appreciate it." She didn't invite me in. Didn't offer her hand to shake. Just stood in the doorway, her expression making it clear my welcome wasn't welcome. "Well," I said, trying to maintain my friendly demeanor despite her chill, "if you need anything or have questions about the neighborhood, I'm right next door. The White House with the blue shutters." "I'm sure I'll be fine," she replied, already closing the door. "I've managed quite well for 66 years without neighborhood advice." It was an inauspicious beginning, but I'd met prickly people before. Some folks just needed time to warm up. Over the next few weeks, I waved whenever I saw her, which wasn't often. Margaret seemed to prefer staying inside, emerging primarily to scold the landscaping crew she'd hired or to walk her small, yappy Pomeranian that left deposits on everyone's lawns without Margaret ever stooping to clean them up. The first real trouble started with the oak tree. A massive red oak stood in my yard, close to our shared property line. It had been there for decades, providing welcome shade to both properties during the sweltering Pennsylvania summers. My grandchildren had a tire swing hanging from one of its sturdy branches. The tree was healthy, regularly inspected, and beloved, at least by me. "Your tree is shedding all over my patio," Margaret complained one Saturday morning, appearing at my fence as I deadheaded my roses. "The leaves are clogging my pool filter, and the acorns are a hazard. I want it removed." I straightened up slowly, my arthritic back protesting the sudden movement. "Good morning, Margaret." "The oak. I'm afraid that's not possible. It's a healthy tree, and it's well within my property line." "It may be on your property, but it's affecting mine," she said, her voice sharpening. "Those roots will eventually damage my foundation. I've already spoken to an arborist." "You had someone examine my tree without asking me?" I was surprised by her boldness. "I had someone examine the risk to my property," she corrected. "He confirmed my concerns. I expect you to handle this promptly." "I'm sorry, but that tree stays," I said firmly. "It's been here for over 60 years without causing any problems. If you're worried about leaves, I can recommend a good service that—" "I don't need recommendations," she cut me off. "I need that tree gone. If you won't handle it voluntarily, I'll pursue other options." She turned and stalked back to her house before I could respond. I stood there, pruning shears in hand, a sense of unease settling over me like an unexpected frost. The next morning, I woke to the sound of a chainsaw. By the time I threw on a robe and rushed outside, 2 men were already removing branches from my oak tree, the ones that extended over Margaret's property. "Stop!" I shouted, hurrying toward them. "What do you think you're doing?" One of the men lowered his chainsaw. "Sorry, ma'am. We have permission to trim branches crossing the property line." "From who?" "That's my tree." "From the homeowner." He gestured toward Margaret's house, where she stood watching from her deck, arms crossed in satisfaction. "She has no right to hire someone to cut my tree without my permission," I protested. "Actually, she does," the man said apologetically. Any branches that cross over her property line, she can legally remove, long as we don't harm the tree itself. We're being careful. I looked up at my beautiful oak, now being brutally reshaped, with branches removed on one entire side. It would be lopsided, unstable, and exposed to disease. I felt tears of frustration well in my eyes. Please, at least let me call my own arborist to supervise this, I pleaded. We've already started, ma'am. We'll be done in an hour. I turned to Margaret, who hadn't moved from her observation post. Was this really necessary? Couldn't we have discussed a more moderate trimming? I tried discussing it, she called back. You refused to remove the problem. Now I'm handling it within my legal rights. The emphasis on legal sent a chill through me. This wasn't about branches or leaves. It was a power play, a declaration of war over territory. And it was only the beginning. Over the next 6 months, Margaret found countless ways to make my life miserable. She complained to the township about the height of my grass if I was even a day late mowing. She called the police about the noise when my daughters and grandchildren visited for a backyard birthday party, at 2 p.m. on a Saturday. She installed blindingly bright security lights that shone directly into my bedroom window all night long. Each time I tried to speak with her reasonably, she rebuffed me with cold precision. I'm simply exercising my rights as a homeowner, was her frequent refrain, delivered with a smile that never reached her eyes. I began to dread going outside if she was in her yard. My blood pressure, normally stable, started to climb. My doctor noticed my increased stress levels during my checkup and suggested meditation. But how do you meditate when you're constantly waiting for the next attack? Mom, this is ridiculous, my younger daughter Diane said during a Sunday visit. You need to stand up to this woman. Or better yet, get a lawyer. Lawyers cost money, I sighed. And what would I even say? That my neighbor is mean to me. That's not illegal. Some of what she's doing might qualify as harassment, Diane insisted. At least talk to someone. I promised I would consider it, hoping the situation wouldn't escalate further. It was a hope born of exhaustion rather than optimism. The following week, I returned home from grocery shopping to find township officials in my front yard, examining my beloved oak tree. Mrs. Jenkins, a woman in a blazer, approached me as I got out of my car. I'm Lisa Barnett from the Township Code Enforcement Office. We've received a complaint about a hazardous tree on your property. My heart sank. Let me guess, from Margaret Wilson next door? Lisa's professional expression confirmed my suspicion. We're required to investigate all safety complaints. The concern is that the tree has become unstable after the recent pruning. The pruning I ordered without my consent, I said, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. I understand this is a sensitive situation, Lisa said carefully. But our inspector needs to make an assessment based on current conditions, regardless of how they came to be. The inspector, a middle-aged man with a clipboard, approached us. Mrs. Jenkins, I'm afraid there are some concerns about the structural integrity of this oak. The removal of the large branches on the east side has created an imbalance. The tree is now weighted heavily toward your house. Can't it be saved? Maybe with cabling or more balanced pruning? I asked desperately. He looked genuinely sympathetic. I'd normally suggest those options, but given the age of the tree and the extent of the pruning already done, he shook his head. I have to classify this as a hazard. You'll need to have it removed within 30 days, or the township will do it and bill you for the work. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. The oak tree that had sheltered generations of my family would be destroyed, and I would have to pay thousands of dollars for the privilege. As the officials left, I noticed Margaret watching from her window, a small smile playing at her lips. That evening, as I sat on my back porch looking up at the doomed oak, I wondered what I had done to earn such enmity from a stranger. Why had Margaret Wilson chosen me as her target? What satisfaction did she get from systematically destroying the peace of my retirement? Little did I know I was about to find out, and the answer would shake my understanding of the past 50 years of my life. Part 2. The tree removal was scheduled for the following Tuesday, a date that loomed in my calendar like an execution. I'd gotten 3 quotes and reluctantly chosen the middle one. $2,800 I hadn't planned on spending from my modest retirement savings. My daughters had offered to help with the cost, but pride made me refuse. This was my problem to solve. The night before the scheduled removal, my doorbell rang just after 8 o'clock. I wasn't expecting anyone, and in my neighborhood, unexpected evening visitors were rare. Peering through the peephole, I was shocked to see Margaret Wilson standing on my porch, her posture rigid, her expression unreadable. For a moment, I considered pretending I wasn't home. But curiosity overcame caution, and I opened the door, leaving the security chain engaged. "Margaret, what can I do for you? May I come in, Eleanor?" Her voice carried none of its usual sharpness. "I believe it's time we had a real conversation." Against my better judgment, I unlatched the chain and opened the door. Whatever this was about, it might be my only chance to understand what was happening and possibly end this neighborly Cold War. Margaret walked into my living room with the same evaluating gaze she'd given me on our first meeting, taking in the comfortable, well-worn furniture, the family photos crowding every surface, the knitting basket beside my favorite chair. "Would you like some tea?" I offered, falling back on the hospitality my mother had drummed into me, despite the strangeness of the situation. "No, thank you," she replied, choosing the most upright chair in the room, a ladder-back wooden piece that had been my husband's reading chair. "I won't take much of your time." She placed her designer handbag precisely on her lap and looked me directly in the eyes. "Do you know why I moved to Maple Street, Eleanor?" The question caught me off guard. I assumed because the house was available, and it's a nice neighborhood. "I chose this house specifically because of you." Chill ran through me. "I don't understand." "No, you wouldn't," she said, her voice taking on a harder edge. "You don't remember me, do you?" I studied her face, searching for familiarity beyond our recent unpleasant encounters. Had we met somewhere before? Community function? Through mutual friends? "I'm sorry, but no, I don't believe we've met before you moved here." Margaret gave a short, humorless laugh. "I've changed quite a bit over the years. Surgeries, hair color, weight loss. But underneath, I'm still Peggy Sullivan from Westridge High School, class of 1975. My mind raced back 50 years trying to place the name. Peggy Sullivan. There had been a Peggy in my graduating class, a quiet girl who... The memory surfaced suddenly. A thin, awkward girl with glasses and braces, always on the periphery of social groups, never quite included. "Peggy," I said slowly. "Yes, I remember now. We had English and chemistry together senior year." "Oh, we had much more than classes together, Eleanor," Margaret said, her composure cracking slightly. "We had Robert Sullivan together too." Robert Sullivan. The name took a moment to register. Bobby Sullivan had been my boyfriend briefly in the spring of senior year. A sweet boy with a shy smile who'd taken me to prom. We'd dated for maybe 3 months before graduation sent us in different directions. Me to community college, him to a state university upstate. Bobby was... "Your brother." I guessed, confused about the connection. Margaret's laugh was bitter this time. "My brother. No, Eleanor. Robert Sullivan was my husband. For 42 years until his death 3 years ago." I stared at her, trying to process this information. I didn't know. I mean, I dated Bobby briefly in high school, but... "You did more than date him," Margaret cut in, her voice ice cold. "You humiliated him in front of the entire school at prom, remember? When you disappeared with Jason Miller, the football captain, and left Bobby standing alone while everyone whispered and laughed." The memory came flooding back with uncomfortable clarity. I had been flattered by Jason's last-minute attention, had slipped away with him during a slow dance, leaving Bobby waiting. It had been thoughtless, cruel even, the kind of teenage selfishness that comes from immaturity and poor judgment. By the time I'd returned to the gym an hour later, Bobby was gone. "Margaret, Peggy, that was 50 years ago. We were teenagers. I made a terrible mistake that night, and I've always regretted it. Have you? She asked sharply. Have you spent 50 years regretting how you crushed someone's spirit for a few minutes of popularity? I sat back, feeling defensive. That's not fair. It was one bad decision when I was 17. I'm sorry for hurting Bobby, truly. But that doesn't justify what you've been doing to me all these months. You have no idea what you did, she said, opening her purse and removing an old photograph, sliding it across the coffee table toward me. That night changed everything. The photo showed a much younger Bobby Sullivan in a hospital bed. His head bandaged, one arm in a cast. He looked pale, damaged. What happened to him? I asked, genuinely shocked. After you humiliated him, he drove home distraught. Crashed his father's car into a tree. That's ironic, isn't it? Her smile was terrible to behold. The head injury affected him for the rest of his life. Seizures, migraines, cognitive difficulties. The promising student who had a full scholarship to study engineering ended up working at his father's hardware store instead. Guilt crashed over me in waves. I had never known. After graduation, I'd lost track of most of my classmates as life pulled us in different directions. I'd heard vague news over the years. Marriages, careers, deaths, but nothing about Bobby Sullivan's accident. I had no idea, I whispered, tears welling in my eyes. I am so sorry. I don't want your apology, Margaret said flatly. Robert was the love of my life, the kind, gentle boy no one else appreciated. I married him the year after graduation. I helped him through the bad days, celebrated the good ones, built a life with him despite the challenges your callousness created. But why now? I asked, genuinely bewildered. Why wait 50 years to confront me? I didn't know where you were until Robert's funeral, she explained. Your name came up when some old classmates attended. I learned you'd married Henry Jenkins and never left this town. After Robert died, I found myself adrift. The anger I'd carried, suppressed for his sake, suddenly had nowhere to go. She straightened in her chair, adjusting an invisible wrinkle from her immaculate slacks. So I decided to find you, to make you understand in some small way what it feels like to have your security, your peace, systematically destroyed. The revelation left me speechless. All these months of hostility, of targeted harassment, stemmed from a terrible mistake I'd made as a teenager. A mistake whose consequences I'd never fully understood. The tree was a nice touch, don't you think? Margaret continued, a cruel satisfaction in her voice. Robert crashed into an oak tree very much like yours. I thought there was a certain poetry in making you remove it. Anger flared within me, pushing through the guilt. So this has all been about revenge. Making me pay for something I did when I was 17. I'm truly deeply sorry for what happened to Bobby. If I could go back and change that night, I would. But this, what you've been doing, is deliberate cruelty. And what you did wasn't, she shot back. It was thoughtless, not deliberately cruel, I countered. There's a difference between a teenager's bad judgment and a grown woman's calculated campaign of harassment. I made one terrible mistake. You've made dozens of deliberate choices to hurt me. Margaret stood abruptly. I can see this conversation is pointless. You still don't understand the magnitude of what you did. And you don't understand that living with bitterness for 50 years has warped your perspective, I said, rising to face her. What happened to Bobby was tragic, and I'll carry that knowledge with me now. But it doesn't justify what you've done, or apparently plan to continue doing. She moved toward the door, then turned back with a cold smile. Enjoy watching your tree come down tomorrow, Eleanor. It's only the beginning. After she left, I sat in my darkened living room for hours, processing everything I'd learned. The weight of unintended consequences pressed down on me. How a single thoughtless act had rippled outward, affecting lives in ways I'd never imagined. I felt genuine remorse for Bobby Sullivan, for the bright future compromised by injury, for the challenges he'd faced throughout his life. But Margaret's calculated revenge campaign couldn't be the answer. Answering 50-year-old pain with fresh cruelty solved nothing. It only created a new cycle of hurt. By morning I had made my decision. When the tree removal crew arrived, I was waiting with a change of plans. "I need you to do something different," I told the foreman, showing him a sketch I'd made. "Can you do it for the same price?" He studied my drawing and nodded. "It'll actually be less work this way. But are you sure? It's a little unusual." "I'm sure," I said firmly. "And when you're done, please take this check and this note to my neighbor." Part 3. The sound of chainsaws filled the morning air as I watched from my kitchen window, a cup of cooling tea forgotten between my hands. Instead of taking down the entire oak, the crew was carefully removing only the most imbalanced branches, then sculpting the remaining trunk and larger limbs into something new, a living sculpture. I had asked them to transform the oak into a peace tree. The concept was inspired by something I'd seen years ago in an art magazine. A damaged tree carved into a symbol of renewal rather than completely removed. The upper branches that remained would continue to live and provide some shade and wildlife habitat, while the trunk would become a visual reminder that broken things can still find new purpose. By mid-afternoon, the transformation was complete. What remained of my oak now featured carved branches reaching toward both properties, with intertwined hearts and a simple message carved into the trunk: "Forgiveness heals all wounds." It had cost the same as removal would have, but offered something removal couldn't: a chance at reconciliation. The check I sent to Margaret covered half the cost, along with a note. "Margaret, I understand now why you've been so angry, and I am truly sorry for the pain I caused Bobby. I can't change the past, but I can choose how to respond in the present. This is my answer to your pain, not more conflict but an offer of peace. The tree now belongs to both of us, a living reminder that we have a choice about how long we carry our hurts. Your neighbor, Eleanor." I didn't expect an immediate response, and I didn't get one. For several days, Margaret's house remained quiet, her curtains drawn. I wondered if she'd even read my note, or if she'd torn it up along with my check. A week passed. The weather turned warmer, and I spent more time in my garden, deliberately visible, deliberately vulnerable to whatever new attack Margaret might launch. But none came. Her security lights were turned away from my bedroom window. Her complaints to the township stopped. 10 days after the tree transformation, I was deadheading my roses, the same activity I'd been engaged in during our first confrontation, when I sensed someone watching me. I turned to find Margaret standing at our shared fence, her expression unreadable. "The tree," she said without preamble. It was not what I expected. I straightened slowly, brushing soil from my gardening gloves. "No, I imagine it wasn't. Robert would have liked it," she said after a long pause, the admission seemingly difficult for her. "He always preferred creating to destroying." "He sounds like a remarkable man," I said carefully. "I wish I had known him as an adult." Margaret's posture remained rigid, but something in her eyes softened fractionally. "He was. Despite everything. He lived with more grace than most people who'd had easier paths. Took a risk. Would you like some iced tea? It's too hot to stand out here talking." She hesitated, 50 years of cultivated resentment warring with something else, perhaps simple human exhaustion with carrying such a heavy emotional burden. "I don't drink sugary beverages," she said finally. "I have unsweetened. And water." Another pause, then a slight nod. "Unsweetened would be acceptable." We sat on my back porch, the transformed oak visible from where we perched on opposite ends of the wicker sofa. The conversation was stilted at first, the weather, the neighborhood, neutral topics that skated around the deeper currents between us. Then Margaret surprised me by asking, "Did you have a good life, Eleanor? After high school?" The question seemed genuine, without the barbed edge I'd come to expect from her. I considered how to answer honestly without seeming to minimize her pain. "It had joy and sorrow like most lives," I said finally. "Henry was a good husband for the 20 years we had together. My daughters are my greatest blessing. But there were hard times too. Henry's early death, years of struggling financially as a single mother, my own health challenges." Pause. "It wasn't the charmed life you might have imagined I had." She nodded slightly, absorbing this. I built my entire identity around being Robert's protector, his advocate. When he died, I didn't know who I was anymore. The anger was familiar, comfortable in a strange way. And now, I ventured. Margaret looked toward the carved tree, its new form catching the afternoon light. Now I'm tired. 50 years is a long time to feed a grudge. It demands constant attention, like a hungry pet that's never satisfied. It's not too late to set it down, I suggested gently. Not forgetting, just not letting it determine your future. Perhaps. She set her glass down precisely on a coaster. Your tree artist did a competent job. It's a conversation piece, at least. Coming from Margaret, this qualified as effusive praise. I accepted it with a nod. We didn't become friends that day, or even in the weeks that followed. But the Cold War between our properties gradually thawed into something like a cautious truce. Margaret's complaints ceased. When her Pomeranian escaped and dug up a corner of my garden, she appeared with replacement plants and a grudging apology. Small steps, tiny bridges across a chasm 5 decades wide. 2 months after our confrontation, I was surprised to find a small package on my porch one morning. Inside was a framed black and white photograph of our high school graduating class and a note in Margaret's precise handwriting. Eleanor, Robert kept this all these years. When I asked him why, he said it reminded him that one bad moment doesn't define a life. He was wiser than I've been. Margaret. I studied the faded photograph. 600 hopeful young faces on the cusp of adulthood, none of us knowing how our choices would ripple outward through time. I found myself in the 3rd row, smiling confidently. 8 rows back, partially hidden, was Peggy Sullivan, looking serious and a bit lost. And there was Bobby. His kind eyes and gentle smile preserved in that moment before everything changed. That evening, I sat on my porch swing watching fireflies rise from the lawn, the carved oak standing sentinel at the edge of my property. From Margaret's deck came the soft sounds of classical music. Debussy, I thought, though I'd never been good with composers. For the first time in almost a year, I felt the tension in my shoulders release. My neighborhood felt like home again, not a battlefield. The future stretched before me, not limitless at my age, but no longer shadowed by conflict. My phone rang, my older daughter checking in as she did most evenings. "How are things with the neighbor from hell?" she asked, her standard opening these days. "Better," I said, watching as Margaret appeared on her deck with a glass of wine, nodding briefly in my direction before sitting in her chair. "We're finding our way to something like peace." Seriously. After everything she did. "Mom, you're too forgiving." I smiled, thinking of the carved message on the oak. "Forgiveness heals all wounds." "Not too forgiving," I corrected gently. "Just old enough to know that carrying anger only hurts the person holding it." As twilight deepened into night, I remained on my porch, comforted by the familiar symphony of summer insects and the occasional distant laughter of children playing despite the late hour. Across the yard, Margaret's silhouette was still visible on her deck, both of us alone yet somehow less isolated than before. 2 women in their 60s, shaped by different journeys but connected by a single moment half a century ago, now linked by a carved tree standing between their homes, a living reminder that even the deepest wounds can, with time and willingness, begin to heal.